Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast. Wait, before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you for tuning into this episode of the Lil Dudes Insect Academy podcast, and just ask you to please hit the like button below or click the subscribe button if you're watching on YouTube, or follow this podcast if you are listening. That really helps the show out. But also, if you want to help us further, then join our Patreon. We have an awesome community that is growing there. Or if you want to make a one-time donation, we are a nonprofit foundation, so head to our website. Both the Patreon and the website will be linked down below. But without further ado, back to the episode. I am your host, Bradon Coy, and I'm super stoked to be here. And we're going to talk about some social insects today, specifically the fungus beetles that my friend Clara works on. So Clara is a PhD student at the University of Virginia. She's studying evolutionary biology, and she studies fungus beetles and their sociality. So I'm super stoked to have Clara on the show. Clara, go ahead and say hello to the people. Introduce yourself for us. Thanks for coming.
Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Clara, and I study the evolution of social behavior in one insect species, but I'm excited to talk to folks who like insects more broadly. Thanks for having me.
Of course, yeah. Thanks for taking your time to chat with us about this. But yeah, we're gonna talk about sociality and what you work on. So I want to go ahead and get started by kind of laying a ground of what is sociality. Like, what does this mean in the context of bugs? And then we'll talk about like the specific species that you work on.
For sure. So, social behavior I think of as just any time two organisms that are the same species interact. So, that can be, courtship, finding mates, it can be fighting behavior, it can also just be sort of hanging out near each other. And there's different organizations to how social different insects are. So, a lot of the times when we say we study social insects, we're studying wasps or bees or something that
Mm-hmm.
has a really, strict social structure to a family or to a hive. My insects, my forked fungus beetles, they live on logs and just sort of hang out near each other, fight sometimes, court each other sometimes. So it's a lot less organized in terms of the social structure. But the beetles are still social. They still, you know, they do a lot of social things.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to kind of emphasize that because I think when a lot of people think of social insects, they think of, the highly social organized colonies that like ants, termites, honeybees, things like that. Um, but that is actually a very small portion of social insects. That's something called eusociality, which is a very organized, like high level of sociality. Um, and there are a number of different criteria that make something eusocial, but I think it's really cool that we're going to talk about non-eusocial and the lesser known social insects. So I'm super stoked about that. But yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that when we're talking about social insects, we're not just talking about eusocial insects. We're talking about um, the I don't want to say less organized because they're not less social. They're just slightly less organized. I think is a better way to put it. But um, yeah, go ahead and tell us a little bit about like what your system that you work on to study this.
For sure. So I work in forked fungus beetles, which is Bolitotherus cornutus. So they're a small beetle that's about the size of a raisin and also kind of looks like a raisin. They're pretty lumpy and like small.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they sit still for most of the day. So they live in eastern forests across North America. And they live on fungus that comes out from trees after the tree is dying or has fallen over. And so these little shelves of fungus come out, and the beetles that I study live on the fungus. They lay their eggs on the fungus. Their larvae go bury into the fungus and create all these little tunnels and eat it. And then
Mm-hmm.
when they pupate and eclose, they come out as, full size beetles, which again is about the size of a raisin, who do all of their living socially on this on these pieces of fungus out in the forest. So they're pretty slow moving. They don't fly very well.
Hmm.
They all the social behavior that they do, we can see out on these pieces of fungus in the forest, which is pretty cool because I don't know if you've studied social behavior before or behavior in general, but it can be really hard to observe in the wild.
Right. Hmm.
Timing your observations is always a challenge, and often you go out there to study one thing and you observe something else, or you have to go back to see what you're looking for. So the fact that they are slow moving, they stay on the same fungus brackets, they stay on the same log for a long time, um, we get to see their social behavior just right out there, like on a stage basically, and it's very cool.
Yeah, that is cool. So do they feed on one kind of fungus, or are
So
they
they
kind of
feed on
generalist?
Oh, sorry. So they feed on three different species of fungus. They're shelf fungus. Polypore is the word I'd use to describe them. But it's Ganoderma applanatum, um, Ganoderma sugi, and Fomes fomentarius. Those are the three species. And I I think the the names you use to describe them are hemlock varnish shelf, which is a pretty great name, and artist's conch, but I don't remember what Fomes fomentarius is in, common parlance.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, and because as far as I was aware, um, I don't know, I might just be talking from nothing right now, but typically I thought that if something was a fungivore, it was kind of a specialist, right? So that's kind of interesting to know.
Yeah. It's often they specialize often a species will specialize on one fungus, and yeah, in this case it's three different ones and they don't even look that similar or have super similar life cycles. Like the
Mm.
Ganoderma sugi is one of them, that's this sort of beautiful brownish orange color that's kind of shiny, and it will pop out of trees for like one season and then decay pretty quickly. And they really like the taste of that one in particular. And we've actually learned to grow it in the lab so
Mm.
that we can create different environments for them and feed them in a captive population. So that's pretty cool. But then the other ones, they'll grow over the course of a couple of summers and then be sitting out there decaying but still structurally pretty sound. So they're like
Mm.
d- really different fungus species that we're working with as well, which is it's pretty cool.
That is cool. Yeah, so break down like the sociality for us. Why, what is like the working theory of why these beetles are social? Because that's pretty interesting to me. Because sociality in insects is fairly rare. For those of you at home, sociality, um, most insects are solitary, for the most part, and so this is interesting to me. It's always interesting to see when sociality pops up in insects and why we think that could be. So tell us a little bit about that. Like, what is the working thought right now about why these insects are social?
So I think a lot of it comes down to the environment that they live in. So they have these small resources that are their food and their shelter all in one, right? And those are small pieces of mushrooms that are coming out of trees in the forest, and one tree will be infected. And so when you have a resource like that that's pretty limited and pretty specific to one location, you're going to end
Mm.
up having a lot of aggregation or like clustering of a bunch of individuals in one spot. And I think as a result of that, they start to interact with each other more. We don't have like there's no dominance hierarchy or queens or anything that you would expect in, some of the eusocial insects, as you talked about before. Um, but they've got horns that they use to fight each other. So for
Mm.
anyone who likes beetles, beetles frequently have really cool weaponry that they use for fighting between the males. And so that's something that we see in our species. And then they also have this like pretty elaborate courtship routine where
Oh,
they'll
cool.
like do this waggle dance, not like a bee waggle dance, but they'll do a dance on top of another individual for multiple hours sometimes. It has this really like raspy sound, like if you rubbed two cheese graters together. It's a really strange
Hmm.
sound. Um, but that I think that those behaviors are a result of the structure of their food and shelter being so local and limited.
Hmm. Yeah. So, do you ever see them struggling to like find food? Like, because that's also interesting to me too. Is like, how would they find such a specialized food source? Um, and the food source is like fairly seasonal too, right?
Yeah, the food source is seasonal. Although two of the species do like they're there over winter, and the third one even is as well. It's just not in very good shape at that point.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't actually know how they find the next food resource. They're pretty long-lived insects, so like I've worked with 5-year-old beetles, and that's
Wow.
5 years at from when they became an adult, so that's pretty old. Um, and that life cycle sort of links up with the life cycle of a log as it is decaying. So they
Mm.
do have to disperse. They do have to go to find other logs sometimes. And they do it, and we don't really know what that process looks like. I said before, they're pretty bad flyers. They're pretty slow walkers, but somehow they're able to detect and go find um, more new logs in the forest, and they do discover them. But yeah, we don't really understand that process, which is pretty cool.
That is exciting, yeah. So you mentioned like some work in the lab with them. Do you like grow them in captivity? Do you like keep the beetles in captivity and study them in captivity as well as in the wild?
Yeah, so we have a captive population that's in this big outdoor cage. We call it a beetlary, kind of
Mm.
like an aviary.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we grow fungus for that, and that is out in the woods. And we have probably 1,000 to 2,000 beetles in there.
Whoa.
And it's open to the elements. They get rained on, they get snowed on, um, but it allows us to do two important things. And the first one is we know who a beetle has interacted with, which other individuals a beetle has interacted with. So when I see them that next summer, I say, okay, I know that it's possible you've interacted with beetle 1, 2, and 3, but I know beetle 4, 5, and 6 lived somewhere else over winter, so you won't have interacted with them. So I can have kind of a clean slate with the social behavior. And on the
Mm.
other cool thing is that we've got all of them labeled by age. So we know how old they are, which lets us do experiments with how they age, how their behavior changes as they age, how their social structures change as they age, and it's pretty cool. So that's basically our captive population, which is in what we call a mesocosm. So it's outside, exposed to the elements, but still like caged off.
Mm. And is 1 to 2,000 individuals like a lot from one area, or is that kind of like an average amount for out in the wild?
So let me see if I can remember this right. Like on an individual log, it can vary quite a lot.
Mm.
But it definitely wouldn't be in the range of like 1,000 to 2,000 individuals. So I think you could see anywhere from like 2 or 3 beetles on a log to maybe 100-ish if it's a pretty robust log, um, with a lot of fungus on it.
Yeah.
Um, but in it, we have 12 beetlearies and then a bunch of smaller containers as well out there. So the populations are more more approximately what they'd experience in the wild.
I see. Yeah, and they're a little dispersed as well. Yeah. Um, so how long have you been at the University of Virginia then? Because did you like start this stuff, or was this research happening before you got there?
So this is all research that I've inherited and I'm still working on with my advisor, Butch Brody, and another collaborator we have at Swarthmore, Vince Formica. And so I'm a fourth year PhD student, and we've been doing research on the forked fungus beetle specifically, evolution of social behavior, looking at social networks, and behavior and age. We've been looking at those probably since I don't know 2010ish, maybe 2008. So there's quite a lot of research on these
Mm.
beetles by our lab.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell us a little bit about like some of the exciting things you have worked on with that. Like, have you found anything cool, um, exciting things you're maybe getting ready to publish, or anything like that? Like, what are some cool things that you found through this research?
Absolutely. So I am very interested in social experience.
Hmm.
And our beetles, as I think I said before, they fight each other. The males have horns and they'll fight if you put them in a container together. They'll fight on the shelf fungus. Sometimes they'll flip each other off of the fungus.
Hmm.
And it's just it's a really interesting set of behaviors. And so I became interested in these effects that we were seeing in a lot of different species, including humans, called winner and loser effects. And
Okay.
those are when you get an experience of winning, and that makes you more likely to win in the future, or you get an experience of losing, and that makes you more likely to lose. So it's not like I'm a bad fighter, I'm going to keep losing. It's that, I lost somehow, and then I
Mm.
am more likely to lose in the future. So I got really interested in this because these phenomena are found in so many different organisms. Like they're found in human tennis players, they're found in
Mm.
mosquito fish and rattlesnakes and fruit flies, which I know is a quite a common study group
Oh
in
yeah.
insects. And so I wanted to see if we had those in the forked fungus beetles. And also to see if it changes with age. So you might expect that as you get older, you also get more social experience. And that could change your behavior in one way or another, maybe making you less responsive to winning or losing a fight. That was my
Hmm.
hypothesis, at least. So I did a kind of wild experiment where I took very large beetles, and those I called super winners, and those would fight just your average beetle.
Okay.
And I would make them lose, and then I would test for those beetles that lost how they do in a subsequent fight. And then I also made super losers, and I would have them fight the sort of average beetle and see if that beetle whose average has now won, how does that change their behavior?
Mm.
So the really cool stuff I got out of it is that winning doesn't matter to these beetles. I mean, it does because they get, the benefits of winning, but it doesn't make them any more likely to win in the future. But
Mm.
if they lose, not only do they lose again in the future, but they behave differently in that next fight. And other beetles don't run away from them. So
Oh.
it changes their behavior going forward, and it also changes the behavior of other beetles that are interacting with them, which is really interesting. So that's one of the things I'm working on right now and will be hopefully published soon. We're working on a manuscript.
Yeah, that's interesting. And they're competing for mates. Is that right?
Mates, resources, we have ideas about what they're competing for, but it's really
Hmm.
hard to say, this it's definitely this and we've proved it.
Okay. Yeah, because I'm curious. This happens a lot in like male to male competition, um, where there's this concept of, the major males will fight, but then there are often like cheater males who will sneak in and like either take the territory or mate with the female or steal some food or something like this. So I'm kind of curious if you saw like any evidence of like a cheater, because if these super losers you were talking about don't ever get don't ever win, they lose, and then they have a higher chance of losing again. Like, that's an interesting thought that I'm having. So, am I just like making this up, or is that like something you might have seen? I'm kind of interested in that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in so many different species, we have cheater males or sneaker males, um, and they often are the ones that are a little bit smaller or have a different set of traits that they can that are not particularly good for being competitive, but are good for other things like sneaking past giant males guarding territory. So in beetles, generally, there are situations where there are sort of two different phenotypes. There are phenotypes being a set of measurable traits,
Hmm.
where you have larger individuals with larger horns, and they've invested a lot of the nutrition that they got into making these large horns, or smaller individuals with basically no horns at all. So they don't
Yeah.
have good nutrition when they're a larva, and they don't even bother putting effort into making a horn. And so you end up getting this really interesting pattern where it sort of looks like there's a big phenotype and there's a small phenotype, but there's not a lot in the middle.
Hmm.
In our beetles, we don't see that. It's basically continuous. There are medium-sized
Okay.
beetles with medium-sized horns. So that plus that indicates to us that there probably isn't a sneaker male type of beetle. Um, and we're working right now on a really cool experiment where we put six beetles in a bucket together. That's the whole experiment,
Okay.
and observed them for 4 hours to see how they respond. Six male beetles of different sizes and different ages. And I think from that we might be able to see if there's another fighting phenotype.
Hmm.
But as of right now, it seems like there is not that sneaker male cheater phenotype that that we see in many other species, which is also kind of cool because you might expect that it would be there.
Yeah. I'm just imagining you like huddled over a 5-gallon bucket for 4 hours, watching these little tiny beetles. Is that basically what it is, or do you like record it?
We record it. So the beetles are nocturnal.
Oh, okay.
And I do all my research at a field station called Mountain Lake Biological Station. It's a great place to work. But we have an indoor area there, and we have this pretty sketchy camera rig that we made out of my advisor's children's former bunk beds. So we
Okay.
like took that into the room, and we get this camera like all the way up at the ceiling, and it takes infrared pictures every 1 second. And
Mm.
so we stitch those together and create a video from it. And then we make a bunch of videos over the course of a summer when the beetles are active. And then in the fall, we spend a lot of time watching through those videos, seeing what behaviors are happening, and scoring those behaviors and when they happened so that we can analyze them that way. But luckily, we don't have to just stare at a bucket of beetles. I mean, that it's a fun thing to do. We've all done it, but
Hmm.
uh, but it's a little bit easier for the data analysis
Yeah.
if you have the video already.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you were talking about a minute ago, where behavior is really hard to um, test and observe in a scientific manner. So yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, so you like jerry rigged a whole rig for that. That's really funny. Um, yeah, so I'm interested in like your past experience with your schooling career so far. So walk us through like a little bit of um, where you went, what you did, and what kind of led you up to this point.
It's a great question. So I am. started being interested in the natural world at a pretty young age.
Hmm.
And I really got my start working as a teen volunteer at the Como Park Zoo in Minnesota. Um, and I would go for the summer, and we had um, demonstrations that we would do. We had ambassador animals that included Madagascar hissing cockroaches
Nice.
and Haitian centipedes and all sorts of, I think, giant African millipedes as well. And we would get to, take these out on zoo grounds and show visitors and talk to them about different things that they were seeing both in the exhibits and then in our little jars. And that was super exciting and really got me curious about both communicating about the natural world and learning a lot more about it because,
Mm.
I would get questions like, well, why is it shaped like that? And I would have no idea and go off and research it and find out that
Yeah.
it's a really cool question to ask.
Hmm.
So from there, I went to undergraduate at University of Chicago, and I studied ecology and evolution there because the questions I ask are always why, how, both of those questions, like why does a behavior exist? Why does an
Yeah.
animal look like this? Why are wasps? Why do they create the nests that they do? I always want to
Hmm.
know why something is the way it is. And I'm also interested in how it is that way and how it develops. So that's why I went there and started studying ecology and evolution. It was great. I had just phenomenal classes. Um, and I think we were speaking about this before the podcast started, but it's where my background is really ecology and evolution more specifically, but I don't have like a really broad understanding of entomology because I was looking at like broad big questions without a lot of the specifics of like how do these work. In fact, the
Right.
only invertebrate class I've ever taken is invertebrate paleobiology, which was mostly trilobites, which is like not
Oh, that's
super
cool.
relevant for
Yeah.
what I'm doing now. Um, but while I was there, I got to do an internship at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Chicago. And I started looking at meerkats and meerkat social behavior, and that was super cool. I got all excited about
That is
meerkat
cool.
social behavior. They stand up on their hind legs and keep watch, and they have this vigilance behavior that they do that's really interesting.
Hmm.
And they'll keep watch in this sort of organized pattern in the wild. And I was working with a group of very old meerkats, like twice the age that they'd get to in the wild, if not three times the age they'd get to in the
Oh,
wild.
wow.
And so they were they were this just like very cute geriatric group of meerkats who were not doing super good with their coordinating of their
That's
vigilance, but
funny.
they would stare deep into your eyes and oh, they were so much fun to watch. So that's where I got like really excited about social behavior
Yeah.
and sort of the complications that happen if you have different ages of individuals or different
Yeah.
sizes of individuals or different levels of aggression. What happens? So I went to that, and then I thought, I would really like to do a PhD in this. I'm interested in asking these questions, but that's a really hard path. You got to work pretty hard at the getting into the school. You don't make a lot of money for a very long time, and I was
Yeah.
worried about this and kind of worried that I didn't have um the background that it takes to do it. So I decided I would take some years off and see if I could find something else interesting that would be good. So I worked a little bit more at the Lincoln Park Zoo, and I worked on their behavioral monitoring program where we studied animal welfare by observing behavior. And I trained a
Oh, that's
bunch of
cool.
volunteers, and it was a really fun job. But also I had to it was part time, and I had to do two other jobs to facilitate it, so that was challenging. Um, and eventually I needed health insurance, so I switched into
Hmm.
environmental consulting. Um, and I worked for a little while doing like working on permitting for wind and solar projects.
Oh,
And
okay.
doing like site assessments and wetland delineations, outlining wetlands. And that was interesting, but I really wanted to get back to why our organisms like they are, or why are they here, or why are they not there?
Mm.
So I eventually decided to come back to graduate school, and I've been so happy doing my PhD at the University of Virginia. I have a fantastic advisor. The study system is so exciting. I love studying forked fungus beetles, and it's been a really positive thing in my life.
That's awesome. So you after you decided, like leading up to deciding to go back to school, um, at the University of Virginia, what was your like thought process with choosing like where you wanted to go and like your story about what's kind of your story about choosing this school specifically, this program specifically?
That's a really good question. It's a tough thing to decide where to go to graduate school.
Yeah.
So I people do it in a lot of different ways. I have a long-term partner, and so where he would be able to work was a big it was a big factor in deciding to go to graduate school. So I made a list of schools that were sort of like my top in terms of interest. I made a
Hmm.
separate list that were schools that I knew were in areas that he could definitely get a job and do his work. And then I made a list of schools that people had told me, this person at this school is really interesting, or this person at this
Mm.
school is potentially would be really good for you. So, the University of Virginia fit two of those, which was my undergraduate advisor told me, I said, I might be moving out to Virginia. Do you know anyone? Do you know
Yeah.
anyone who would be a good fit for my interests? And he had given a talk at Mountain Lake Biological Station where my advisor is the director. And he said, you should definitely talk to Butch Brody. So that school got on my list for those two reasons. And I applied to a bunch of others, and I was in the end considering between three different schools. And UVA had the program that fit my interests the most. It gave me the most money, and I had the best fit by a long shot with that advisor. So I just
Mm.
knew that he was what I was looking for in a mentor at this stage, which is somebody who would really challenge my ideas, but also give me a lot of independence. So from
Yeah.
all of that, it worked out really well. I chose the
Sounds like it.
University of Virginia.
Yeah, that's awesome. So so you jumped right from bachelor's to PhD, right?
I took off 4 years. 4 years after my bachelor, I tried not to do it. I tried not to come back to get a PhD.
But what I mean is like you didn't do a master's.
Oh, correct. I did not do a master's. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of something I'm kind of learning about because I'm a little interested in doing that to like jump right from the bachelor's to the PhD, skip the master's. So yeah, I've been kind of hearing from people that have done that, um, and yeah, it's just something I'm thinking about. But
Yes.
yeah, so sounds like you've got a pretty good gig at UVA, and you're getting ready to graduate, right?
Yep. In about a year.
So, are you fourth year or fifth year?
I'm a fourth year, and so I'll
Fourth year.
have probably ending the end of next school year. That's the goal.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and looking forward, like what are your thoughts about like the future? Like what is like the dream situation? What's the dream job that you would want after you're done?
Oh, that's such a good question. Um, I would love eventually to be a professor doing research and be affiliated with a field station.
Mm,
So I currently work at Mountain Lake Biological Station, and it's been just the best community of um, everyone from the children of the folks working there to the undergraduates who are coming in for classes and for, research across over the course of a summer.
yeah.
And then the graduate students who are there working on their dissertations, and then the faculty and other folks who come through. It's just like a really rich environment. And I love that as a place to study and learn and teach.
Mm,
And so having something like that that I could facilitate or be a part of would be incredible. So yeah, I think like dream job right now would be I would leave and get a postdoc, which is the next stage after you get your PhD, but before you get are competitive for a faculty job. So get a postdoc somewhere interesting, probably get a little bit more into taxonomy, phylogeny. I'm not really sure, but I've been focused on evolution at a really small scale for a while,
mm-hmm.
and I think getting a little bit of that broader context would be useful. And then
Yeah,
probably going back into studying, I mean, I we don't really know why winner and loser effects exist, and so for right now that question is very fascinating to me, and if I could tackle that in the forked fungus beetles or another cool system, I would be very excited to do it. So that's the dream job.
that's
Research,
awesome.
mentoring, bit of teaching, and working at a field station.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, so for research, you just mentioned you're interested in the winner loser scenario. Is that like the dream thing that you'd want to research? Like, because, if you become a teacher, you're going to research, you could be researching for the next, many years. So, like, is that the thing you want to answer? Or do you have interests in, like, anything else with regards to that?
So that's a challenge that I'm, working on and will
Mm-hmm.
probably have more information as I continue.
Yeah.
But I'm generally interested in how individuals perceive their social environment
Mm.
and respond to it. So winner and loser effect is sort of a subset of that. I've been going down this pretty exciting rabbit hole about chemical communication and leaving behind, chemicals that can indicate age potentially, that could
Okay.
indicate like social status, like whether you'd won or lost recently. Um, and that's been fascinating. I get
Mm.
to collect the scents from these beetles by putting them on a little piece of paper for 24 hours. And then I run it through a machine and find out how many how much of each type of chemical is in there and see
Mm.
if it varies with age, see if it varies with size. So this has been an area that I'm really excited about because, as you know, social information for us is pretty visual, is very
Oh, yeah.
auditory, but for insects, a lot of their communication is sound based or chemical based. So it's this whole world that, we can't really perceive ourselves. And I don't
Yeah.
know. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's like um, what would it be? Fourth dimension, fifth dimension? It's like another realm that humans don't interact with. Is like olfactory and like pheromones and stuff like that. Like obviously we do a little bit, but comparatively to insects, it's like nothing. Um,
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating.
yeah, one thing that to put this into perspective, one thing that I learned recently was, there were some researchers who put a pheromone of a um, the pheromone that a dead ant puts off. They put that pheromone onto a live ant, and in a colony they have like a designated trash pile, right? They've got like a designated place where they put their trash and they put their dead, stuff like that. And the researchers put the pheromone on a live ant, and the other ants kept picking up the ant and bringing it to the trash pile. Um, and so that kind of puts into perspective like how chemically driven insects are, right? Um, like they don't really understand that, oh, this ant actually is alive. Um, well, first of all, their eyes aren't very good, especially in the nest. It's dark, but that really paints a picture of like how driven by chemical cues insects are. So that's really interesting. And is that um, research you're talking about? Is that part of your dissertation, or is that like a separate thing you've worked on?
It's part of my dissertation. So I have a fellowship this year that means that I'm working with a faculty member at Virginia Tech, another school
Mm-hmm.
nearby, to work on figuring out what chemical cues, what pheromones these beetles might be giving off. So yeah, that's what I'm working on right now.
That's cool. Um, so from like a science perspective, I'm kind of interested. What are like what's like the big picture with this research? Like obviously understanding sociality is important, but what like what's the driver of like why this research is important? Because there is some um like social political aspect of doing research where whatever you're doing research, you do need to be able to justify. So I want you to kind of do that for us. Like, why is the research you're doing really exciting and important to science and the future as well?
So this is always a challenge because when you study, an insect like this that doesn't really have any direct links to humans,
Hmm.
um, we don't have any illnesses related to
Yeah.
it. It doesn't eat our crops. It's not, it's a challenge to justify things that are not directly connected to humanity, and that makes a
Hmm.
lot of sense. For me, I'm somebody who is very much of the opinion that growing knowledge on its own is beneficial and
Oh
that
yeah.
who knows
Hmm.
what will come out of that. So,
Right.
within the context of my field, within the field of entomology, within the field of evolutionary biology, it's super important to justify my research and contextualize it. So, I've been working on this. I hope I do an okay job here, but um, these winner and loser effects are appearing throughout the tree of life.
Hmm.
They're in insects, they're in mammals, they're in birds, they're in any organisms we know that fight each other. Not in any organisms, but in many different organisms where it's been
Yeah.
tested. And to me, this is basically an example of something that is evolving multiple times
Oh yeah.
but with different like baseline machinery to work with. And that to me says that there's a really important reason why a pattern like this would keep arising, even if we don't yet understand why it's there. So that is my big justification is that winner and loser effects keep popping up and we don't really understand why they would be advantageous. If they are advantageous, we have a couple of hypotheses, but nobody's really um, determined for sure why they exist. So
Right.
that's one reason. And then the other reason is that I think the your environment and the way you interact with your environment is just a very central question in biology generally,
Hmm.
in ecology, in evolutionary biology, and I think expanding the environment to consider social, the social environment as well, and the individuals that an organism is interacting with gives us a much richer picture of what their life looks like. And the sorts of things that would be important to a beetle will tell us, what has evolved over time. So that's sort of how I justify my research within the context of evolutionary biology and ecology. And then when I tell other folks about it who say, I'm not sure why that would be relevant to me, my argument is that I think basic research is incredibly important. And I say
Oh
basic
yeah.
research in that it's not directly applicable to, humans. Um, I think it's a really important thing and you never know what's going to come out of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you might find something that's super surprising that can be applied to all other, kinds of systems. That kind of stuff happens all the time. So, yeah, really exciting stuff. So, I want to go back to like your upbringing, like in school. Like, what kind of got you as a young kid, like into science and becoming that volunteer? Um, what kind of led up to that? I'm kind of interested in like, were you always into science, or was there like one teacher or one moment that made it click for you?
That that's a tough question. Think I've always been a kid who like picked up sticks and leaves and insects and made piles of
Mm-hmm.
things, collected snails from the ground and put them
Oh yeah.
somewhere else, all of that. So I think just fundamentally I've always been pretty interested in that. But I wasn't always interested in being a scientist. I had a few really fantastic teachers that made it seem more like a possibility. So my
Mm-hmm.
seventh grade science teacher was and sixth grade was Miss Amundsen, and she just had a really um vibrant way of explaining science and also letting us test things ourselves,
Oh,
which
cool.
is a huge part, I think, for me of the excitement of science is that you get to be the first person to know something and you get to test it yourself.
Yeah.
Um, and so, getting to do hands-on experiments was very, very exciting. Um, and she was just a fantastic teacher. Um, but yeah, I mean, like, as somebody whose main passion is evolutionary biology, that's not something that we got taught that much in school. And
Yeah.
there were also like permission slips that had to go home usually, where kids could opt out of coming to that section. So as a result of that, it was like a small module that was pretty contained and you didn't have to go to it,
Yeah.
which meant that, I didn't really have much foundation in that area that would end up being like the coolest thing in my opinion,
Yeah.
until college. Even though I would of course go to those classes, it was just small isolated part of the
Mm.
curriculum, as opposed to, as I see it now, sort of a framework for understanding biology, even anatomy, physiology, diseases, disease
Yeah.
ecology. Like, it all fits inside of this framework in the way that I see the world.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I love to hear all the different ways that people have found their journey into science and then for some of us into entomology. It's really, really cool. And also, I want to highlight for you listeners that you can take bugs all kinds of places. Clara doesn't technically have a degree in entomology like a lot of other people do, but you can use bugs to study anything. So I just want to mention that you can be an evolutionary biologist and use bugs as your study system. And the nice thing about that is um, you're less limited with the school you can go to. So lots more schools have evolutionary biology than an actual entomology degree. So yeah, I just want to mention that for you guys. That you can, uh, you could take your degree in entomology anywhere, and vice versa. You could take your degree in anything else to entomology. So yeah, that's really cool. And I'm glad I was able to.
I want to piggyback off that, if
Yeah,
that's
go
okay.
ahead.
So,
Yeah, of course.
in our field, right, in my field, there are many different taxa you could study. You could study mammals, you could study birds. And a lot of the questions those are my two examples for this. So,
Yeah.
a lot of the questions that you can ask in those systems, it's awesome to ask that in insects. So, for example, birds, we study parental care a lot and how
Yeah.
they are, laying eggs, taking care of and defending a nest, feeding their offspring. There are burying beetles that do that themselves
Mm-hmm.
in insects, right? And they have robust parental care. They take care of their babies, they
Oh
lay
yeah.
eggs, they defend the nest. And you can have these, like, you can tackle these questions from, different species, different environments, and it's fascinating. So there are so many ways that studying insects, even as somebody who comes in with different interests, finding out that of this rich world that exists out there, and
Mm-hmm.
knowing that you can study the questions you're interested in a really, really cool system that is also less investigated than your average, I don't know, bluebird, for example. Like,
Yeah.
that is so exciting. And vice versa, if you study insects, you're excited about insects generally, it's a very easy way to get into social behavior, for example, or, any other ways of looking at the world. You can use insects to do that. So it's, I don't know, I just think entomology is so cool and so
Yeah.
complicated.
Yeah, and it's so exciting that more people are starting to like kind of take notice. It seems like um, that bugs are really really important and they're connected to literally everything. Um, so yeah, really cool to hear about all the things you've worked on. And one more thing I want to go over. We talked a little bit about like your plans for your future, like your ideal situation. But like aside from that, are there any like fun trips you want to go on or research that you want to do aside from all of that? Like some more fun like plans for after you graduate.
So I've gotten really excited about forked fungus beetles specifically, one
Mm-hmm.
species.
Yeah.
And there is a project that's been pitched in the lab as this sort of dream project for all of us, which would be going around the world to other beetles in that same um, genera, so in the same genus as
Yeah.
the forked fungus beetle, and um, seeing how they respond, how they're shaped, how they have whether they have similar patterns
Mm.
to the forked fungus beetles. And I think that would be just a very, very cool project and would involve some travel. There's sort of, I think most of the close relatives are circumpolar, so in, Russia and Finland and Scandinavia and Japan.
That's cool.
And that would be such a cool thing to go around the world and do. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but I think that would be pretty phenomenal. And then I'm
Yeah.
always excited for a summer at a field station wherever that might be. So that for sure.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about taxonomy and phylogeny and um, all that stuff, and that could be really interesting to see. Like, are these social behaviors similar in these other species of? Are they all fungus beetles in that genus? Like, is that or is that a family? I'm not sure.
So the family's Tenebrionids, that's their family, the
Okay.
darkling beetles.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Yeah.
but the fungus beetles, I think, are throughout. I'm not entirely sure. This is
Yeah.
where my background as not an entomologist really comes in as a
Yeah.
challenge.
No,
Um,
that's okay. Yeah.
but I think most of the ones in that genus do live on the fungus.
Yeah. That could be cool to see though. Like, if the distribution across the planet is like how different it is and how their social structure differs across the globe could be really really cool. Um, with the basis of the forked fungus beetle in Virginia. Yeah, really really cool stuff. But aside from like research and school and all that stuff, what are some other like personal hobbies and activities that you enjoy in your spare time?
I think they're crucial to keeping me sane.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
so I sing in choir.
Oh cool.
There's a lovely classical group in Charlottesville that I've been a part of. And getting to sing Beethoven and all of that, and kind of
That's
a big
cool.
choir is really fun. I also swing dance. I'm in Lindy Hop. It's jazz dance that is partnered, social, improvisational, and it's really fun. So there's a group at the University of Virginia that I'm the vice president of and teach a lot of lessons for that. And then
That's
I go
fun.
to the community group as well in Charlottesville. And it's the best because it's, very, very different from my day job. Both of those things are, and the creative outlet is good. And then other than that, I love cooking. So I just made a bunch of Szechuan food for my
Oh
birthday,
nice.
had like a whole multi-course meal. It was really exciting. So, digging into a new recipe is always exciting.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I think that's about it. Do you have anything else you want to say to the people? Like, did we miss anything or anything else you wanted to go over before we close up for everybody?
I don't think we missed anything, but I'm curious about your what you were thinking about with the masters versus PhD. Like, or is that something you're weighing? I know that many of your listeners are maybe considering this as well, and I think it's
Mm-hmm.
good to talk about.
Yeah, so I'm not really sure yet. Because part of me is like, yeah, I want to be in school for as long as possible, and then another part of me is like, no, I want to get the degree so that I can start with my career. Um, but I'm not really positive yet. I'm not really sure. I'm really interested in ants. So I'm really interested in ants, and specifically more of their social disease control in the colony. Um, so like how they defend against pathogens and disease within the colony, how they deal with their dead, um, maybe antibacterial, antimicrobial things that they use to protect the nest. Like especially some of the farming, um, there are some ants that farm fungus, and they use like basically a natural pesticide that they create themselves to fight against pests against the fungus. So there are some other bacteria and fungus that try to get in to eat their fungus, and they defend against them naturally, which is really cool. Um, so I'm kind of interested in those things, and then also how they can relate to human public health. Um, so that's kind of what I'm interested in, but I'm kind of trying to decide um, because ultimately what I want to do is I want to teach, do this, the podcast, and then also run my nonprofit, which the podcast is a part of. Um, Writing curriculum and courses and things for high school and middle school students. So that's like the end goal. Like the end goal would to be to be a professor, um, and work on my organization as well. Um, but I do need to do research to get through school, so that's kind of what I'm thinking. But um, yeah, so I'm kind of trying to figure that out still, and it's also kind of a tricky thing because I actually transferred into UF. So I transferred in with my associate's degree. So by the time I graduate, I will only have been here for 2 years. Um, so I'm also kind of trying to decide, like, obviously I'll apply to a bunch of different places, but so if I got into UF, would I want to stay here? Because a lot of people say, you should, for research, you should go to a couple different schools. But I will only have been here for 2 years, so I'm like, do I want to get the bachelor's here and then something else here and then move somewhere else? I'm not sure. So I'm a third year undergrad, so I've still got some time to figure that out. But I've just been kind of talking to people about maybe skipping the master's, or maybe um, if I should go somewhere else, or I'm kind of still exploring all that. But that's kind of what I'm thinking for the long term. So yeah.
There are so many different paths you can take to get where you want to go, and also you take the paths and you're like, oh, I meant to go, I thought I was going this way, and I ended up going this way instead, and I like it better. So I
Hmm.
don't know, I wish you luck with that. It sounds like a lot to be considering, but the things that I used to figure out whether I was going to master's or PhD is what sort of work I wanted to do after that.
Hmm.
And the sort of central theme of it ended up being that I really wanted to ask my own questions instead of helping other people answer theirs. Even though I think that's a really wonderful job to have.
Yeah.
That's what motivates me, is asking my own questions and finding the ones that are interesting and finding the gaps. So for that, you need a PhD, and you could kind of skip the masters if you felt like you were ready to go whole hog into it.
Yeah.
Um,
And if you can get in too, there's that aspect too.
yeah, that as well. The
Yeah.
time off after my undergrad really helped, honestly.
It helped. Okay.
Oh yeah, I think it made me more competitive for sure. And also just personally, like I was really ready to go into the PhD
Okay.
and hit the ground running with treating it a little bit more like a job instead of school, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. It's been helpful.
So you're saying like it might have helped you competitively because of your age, or like you were the same age as other applicants, or what do you mean by that? I'm interested in that.
So I mean, getting a master's degree, I think it's not equivalent. It's more work, more school than what
Yeah.
I did. But I got more research experience, and I got more like mm, a variety of experience. Because I think one thing that professors look for and programs look for when you're coming for a PhD is that's like 5 years. It's a slog, right? You
Mm,
want people who definitely want to be there,
yeah.
and are willing to do that type of work for that long.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like not everyone figures that out right away. Not everyone who goes in stays in a program, and that's totally fine. Like you figure out what you want out of the world and you go for it. But me coming back after several years off with a really clear understanding of why I wanted to do it, that made me a
Mm,
competitive applicant. That plus the other, experience I got.
yeah. And it's more like practical experience that you got than just another degree. And obviously, there's nothing wrong with that either. But it's just a different. What I've heard is, um, it depends on what you want to do because what I've heard is that the school cares about your GPA, but when you want to go do research, um, the faculty care about your experience, and your research experience a lot more. Um, so if you have the research experience but not the GPA, you don't get into the school to begin with, and vice versa. If you can get into the school but none of the advisors are interested in your research, but you have a good GPA, then you know you could end up going there and then get stuck because no one wants to support your research, right? Um,
In my field, we have it
so
where you pretty much go in knowing you're going to work with a specific advisor.
yeah.
And so you reach out ahead of time,
Hmm.
even do like pre-interviews sort of thing to see if you want to apply. Um, and that often cuts out the GPA needs. I mean, I think a really depending on how low your GPA is, you need to have like some explanation of what happened and what's how you're moving forward from it.
Right.
But GPA was less of a challenge
Mm.
in my experience
Interesting.
than the research experience. That if you're going to a research program, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, well, I don't want to take too much of your time. Is there anything else you wanted to chat about before we close it out, or
No, I think that's all. This has been fantastic, and I'm honored to be on an insect podcast like this because I'm fascinated by insects generally and wouldn't really go so far as to call myself an entomologist, but I'm working on it.
hey, I mean, what even is an entomologist, right? I mean, like we're all honorary entomologists, so thanks so much for doing this with me. Super fun to talk about all this cool stuff you work on, and thanks for taking the time. It was super fun. Um, yeah, thanks again, Clara. It was really fun to talk with you, and I hope you guys enjoyed listening as well.
Thank you.